Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of Project Virtual Conference 2018. Can you guys hear me good?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Today we have Cindy Lewis with us, and she will be presenting on 10 tips for scheduling success. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that you can use the chat option at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions or chat during the session. Without much further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Sheree. So welcome everyone. I wanted to recap what we're doing in this session. I'll actually be sharing stories from customers who have succeeded or failed and give you guidance on lessons you can learn from that. And my mission is that you can take these tips and make them a guideline for success in your business. Now, first off, we might be curious, why do we care about scheduling? Here's what I could say is a great takeaway. Scheduling drives our business value, and it can actually accelerate your business towards achieving its goals faster. Again, thank you out to those sponsors that helped get us here for this wonderful event. And let's kick off our first tip. Know your value discipline. You may not have heard of this concept before, but successful companies choose one of 3 value disciplines to excel in. In fact, the market leaders, over 80% of them, focus on a distinct strategy. If you have a value discipline, you create momentum for your business that competitors actually can't match. And I'm going to share some examples with you of these value disciplines. So first off, product leadership. A business that believes in product leadership, they compete against themselves. The customers see their products as the best. And while I'm talking through these examples, I would love for you to put in some companies you can think of that are product leaders right in the text chat. A product leader company, they spend their internal dollars on research and development. We also have operational excellence. So their mission is to make reliable offerings at a competitive price. And they spend their money on standards and efficiency. And the third value discipline I wanted to highlight is customer intimacy, where really the business lives on customer relationships, and they spend their money on understanding customers' needs. And I actually have an example from just last week. I was taking an Uber in California, and my driver owns a shoe business, but he specializes in people with health-related problems that affect their feet, especially diabetics and others. And he said what he does is he keeps a really detailed log about these customers so he can call them regularly. He knows exactly what their problems are and can recommend the next step, and each year make sure they come back for obviously another purchase. So let's stop for a minute and look in the text chat. Please throw out your ideas. What would be a company that you would consider a product leader, excellent in operational excellence, or customer intimacy? And after I hear from you, I'll share my ideas. Coca-Cola. Thank you. And just to keep things rolling, let me give you some other ones. Another one, Vaseline. I'm sure many of you recognize, obviously, Nike because of my slide. When I've delivered this in the past for the Project Management Institute, they said those Apple phones, they seem to be leaders in their industry. Another example of customer intimacy is I'm working with, in my local area, some hospitals. They said, we really want to focus on not necessarily repeat customers, but knowing the best of our customers. Another key example is Nordstrom. They're very good at customer intimacy. In fact, if you've been in one of their stores, they will greet you by name. Operational excellence, I can give you some examples. How about McDonald's and Walmart? They're very efficient, very good at their processes, and they try to make them better and better. Even FedEx and Southwest come into play. Now, why is this so important? If you don't pick a value discipline, here's where your company fails. You have fractured strategic direction, a weakened brand. Maybe your business suffocates because you're trying way too hard to be good at everything. So here's what I recommend that scheduling can help drive you to, is focus on your value discipline, but don't fail in the other two. So if these are the three we're looking at, we're a product leader. That doesn't mean we can't deliver the product. If you ordered a Nike shoe, you have to continue and be good with customer relations and operational excellence, but you still want to showcase leadership. So kind of a takeaway for you is go back to work, ask what your value discipline is of many people in your organization, and see if your schedules line up to that. If it turns out your company has no experience in this area, here is another takeaway, a great book you can read that talks all about this and all the research that was done to come up with these value disciplines. And thank you everyone for your participation in the text chat. Now let's dive into tip number 2, define your planning approach. So here's another real life example. I was working with a lighting company, and they heard from their competitors and from their boss that agile is the way to go. We should do all these agile methods. We'll make more money, be more successful. Well, here's the problem. They started an agile approach, but they abandoned their old way of doing things. So they essentially threw out something they were very good at. They had an excellent manufacturing process in a traditional waterfall fashion that they abandoned. So I said, hey, maybe a better approach is to use traditional waterfall planning, but mix in agile where it makes sense. And an example I gave them is I said, it looks like you're looking at USB adapters or other plugs into your lighting components. How about we take that R&D component, spin that off into an agile project. Once you figure out the approach, plug it back into your manufacturing process. So that's something that you should talk about, is what is our approach? Some other things you should think about is how detailed should that schedule be in our approach? For example, are we going to take our work breakdown structure, and let me just pull one over here, and break it down into a couple of levels, or are we going to go into level 3, level 4, level 5? How much breakdown is absolutely necessary? If you don't need those levels, let's not use that. Also, talk about estimating in your planning. Do we get estimates from a database? Like if you're in construction, is there a database you can look things up? Another place for estimates is perhaps, do you go to the client for the estimate of what they want, or do you derive it and give it out to them? I was just working with a company in Southern Florida, and they believed the client was always right. And the client was giving them the schedule for what they were producing. And I said, right there is your point of failure. You're letting them control your plan when you should be controlling it, but asking them to input the key checkpoints they need to see. So those are some things you can do. Also, I want to point out that maybe how you use project is even an approach. And some of you are probably familiar with Team Planner View. It is a project professional or subscription feature. I'm working with a small marketing company that says Gantt chart is too complex. We just want to know who does what and see it graphically. We do not understand linking. It's too complex for us. So they simply create the tasks and drag them to the person. They do not care about constraints or anything like that. And they're running that small marketing department with just this view. So you can even make tool decisions when you define your planning approach. By the way, there could be some exceptions to the rule, like we heard about in other sessions today. Like, for example, Thomas Boyle's session, he talked about we're under government requirements. We do have to have those 3 to 5 indent levels. Now, I want to share another story you might like. This is about a company that said, we are going to do everything right by hiring a PMO director. So they did their research, used the HR department, hired this new director. The very first month that she took over, she implemented company standards like Microsoft Project. She gave everyone some project management books. She even developed reports in Excel. So it sounds like she's doing great. The president said, how about I send you out and work with our customer that is really struggling right now. We actually have an unhappy customer. Why don't you see what you can do? So to the president's surprise, this new PMO director actually did not help with the customer. They actually lost the customer, and the customer wrote an angry letter to the company saying, you ended up costing me twice as much money and I didn't get what I want. So of course the president does a little research and said, well, what happened here? And ironically enough, I was helping with a Microsoft project schedule. And what I did is they said, hey, Cindy, do you have any advice? Or can you talk to us about this situation? We know you're good with project. Maybe you can understand this. And I happened to get a copy of the person's resume. And believe it or not, their resume said at the top, their name, comma, PMI, which is the Project Management Institute, not PMP, which is the actual credential. This person was not certified at all. So a takeaway there is if you are going to the experts, know what credentials you are trying to staff. So let's go on to tip 3, your level of detail. Some of you have heard some of these ideas before, but let me give you some new insights. So one idea is to take a look at your schedule, and I will just turn on row 0 for simplification purposes. And way at the top here, I've got a summary duration. You can use that as a marker of what should be within range and outside range of our project. For example, some companies adopt the 1 to 10% rule. If this was rounded to 200, maybe our lowest detailed task is 2 days, our longest task would be 20. What I always say is, I don't care if you use a rule of thumb, if it has business value, put it in the schedule. If customer sign-off is important, put it there. Some other things I say is this can help make sure you have checkpoints throughout the schedule. You may need more than that. So frequently what I do is I sometimes add a row, and I'll use one of our new features here, and I do something called project management audit. And of course I make that a 0 duration auto scheduled task, and that can help me make sure that everything is done above. If you don't have key checkpoints in your schedule, This can help you. Some other things that I want to kind of point out is don't let the detail get in the way of where other tools could benefit, like a checklist. So as an example, I was working with an architecture engineering firm, and they had a registered architect that would review drawings before they were stamped and sent out of the company. And they were putting every line item in their Microsoft Project schedule for that review. And I said, why don't you just hyperlink to an Excel document or some other tool with that checklist? Because only the architect cared about the checklist. The project manager just needed the line that said the drawings were reviewed or audited. So that's kind of an interesting point. Also, if it makes a difference for the organization, make sure it's in here. I'm working with an organization right now that for their ISO 9000 certification, there is a sticker that has to be put on their products for safety. That is in their schedule, even though it only takes seconds to actually happen. So decide your level of detail. By the way, here's another great takeaway. When you're doing estimates, you can use these additional columns, and maybe you've seen these before, to put in information that project does not track. So here's a quick tip. I can go to the Add New Column and actually type in the name of something I want to add. Yes,
hey,
go ahead.
Hey, Cindy, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm not able to see the tabs or the screen that you're referring to, and I do see 3 people on the chat asking the same question.
You can't see Microsoft Project?
No, we do see, however, the slide that says identify your level of detail.
Okay, so thank you for jumping in. Can you see project now?
Not yet. I see the whole PowerPoint stack.
Okay, let me see how I fix this. Thank you.
No problem. Sorry for the interruption, guys.
How about that? Does that work?
Yes, I can see that now. Can you guys message to see if you can see it? Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like I have to stop sharing perhaps in between. No problem. So what I was doing, let me undo that last step, is I was showing you a cool little Microsoft Project trick. On the Add New Column, you can actually type in your own heading and it will quickly use one of the available text fields. And you can type in just about anything you can think of. I'll just put in a few key examples. One that I really like is something I add to all of my projects called a confidence level. And I can, this is just really a made up field, I can put in my confidence about that estimate. So when I have a schedule that's somewhat detailed, people know how much information I had when I put that estimate together. Let me see if I can share my other screen again. And I believe we're seeing Microsoft Project, or excuse me, PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So here's another tip. Make the schedule logical. So think about this. If you wrote a paper in school and you turned it in and your teacher found a mistake right in the first paragraph, and you're thinking, why didn't I see that? You've read it over and over again. Well, maybe what's happened is you need a second set of eyes. Every time someone says, look at a schedule, and they don't really see what's wrong, I say, give it to someone else. And let me try to share project again. I have an example right here in this first phase. I have a mistake of something that is not business logical. Now, your predecessors might look correct, other things might look correct, but business-wise, it doesn't make sense to do a task. And if you're not seeing it, let's hit number 5 here. Do you see how this task does not belong in this stage? And if that's something you wouldn't see, I can almost guarantee someone else can find it for you. Also, another tip, and I do this a lot, I'm working actually with a manufacturer right now. They create custom products, and they were saying we are not delivering on time. That was their problem. And I happened to glance at Network Diagram View, and this is designed to trace the logic in your schedule. And the critical path is very obvious, but I said, let's look at the non-critical path. And I would scroll around, and I noticed stuff like this one, which is not connected anywhere else in the schedule. And I said, while you have all the tasks in, you have no logic behind it, and maybe that task should be driving a critical component and they're not linked up together. And it was really nice to be able to see that. Also, as far as logic, something that you may struggle with internally is companies have an order. So for example, you might have a project management process order, but that could differ than what department order is. Why not use one of these many custom fields to set up that departmental grouping, and then the logic makes sense for whoever is looking at it? So that's another idea. And let's go to tip 5. So standards. I was working with a company that is in the movie business, and they actually audit audio quality. And their VP of one of their divisions said, Cindy, I don't know why we are not getting things done. Can you talk to people and just find some questions out? So here's what I did, is I started asking people about their project management processes and their schedule. Shockingly enough, no one that was running projects knew they had a project management office in the building next door. Many of them did not know that Microsoft Project was their scheduling standard. Another thing I did is I said, what's a critical path? No one in their group could define it. And shocking to that vice president is I asked someone that had been running projects for 15 years. I said, before you try to fix what you think is wrong, let's start with some best practice project management terminology and get people started. Another thing that you can do is I worked with an organization where they said people tend to get overworked and they forget to take breaks. So they actually used one of the many popular steppers on the market, gave everyone a stepper, and they said, you are allowed at least 2 stepper breaks whenever you feel like it. So if you're not a required participant on a meeting, you can say, I am going to get my steps in. And they found out that actually it increased productivity because people were taking breaks. Did you know that the average knowledge worker typically only breaks for their lunch 15 minutes or less? Another issue for standards is, let's say I was working this time with a development company. They produce websites for many different organizations, and they were hired to make a website for a company that had an office in Canada and an office in the US. And I was really happy that they delivered the project on time. The US office was very happy, but when they showed it to the Canadian team, the complaint was, well, where is the French version of this website? The French version did not even exist. The US team did not have an approach where they asked for assumptions and other constraints to every project. And because they never discussed this, obviously that project was a failure for that customer. Let's talk about tip 6, train your best practices. So some of you have been attending other sessions today, And I'll just recap some things you've already heard. For example, in Colin Quiring's session, he talked about you connect to other systems. How could you represent that? You could use notes for that. Also in James Mill's session, he talked about documenting risk events, and he used notes. I have found out notes can truly save my life as a schedule professional. For example, I had a customer that said, I want to change something in your project. And they sent me an email that says, this is my authorization. I won't send anything formal, but I want you to use this as an authorization. Well, the customer forgot about it and were shocked that the project was later than they expected. And what I had in my note was reference to that email, that date and time that showcased what the customer sent. And believe it or not, that documentation can hold up in court. Email can be considered a contract, at least for some of us in the US. Another way that notes are super important is you can document the reality of what has actually happened. I was working with a company up in northern Michigan, and they were a retail remodel site. And what happened to them is they had a forklift driver that wasn't paying attention, drove into a hole. And that delayed the project. Immediately, they call a safety officer. They had to get some equipment to haul that forklift out. And the project manager took a picture of that, pasted that in the note on the task. And now, anytime someone asks about that, that note is right there for people to look at. Just in case you aren't familiar with notes, you could simply double click on any task, and there are notes right there. You can also go to the notes icon, but you may not have known that you could actually paste pictures in there. Very, very useful. Some other things. Why do I say train your best practices? Let me give you another illustration. I'm working with a company, and they actually are in the IT field, and they have a very extensive project management process. However, some people put in different number of milestones than the rest. And I was asked to kind of survey them to see what they're doing. One person in the organization was following PMI's scheduling standard that said there's a start and finish milestone in every schedule. Somebody else said, no, I think there should only be milestones at the end of each of our phases or key gates. And someone else said, hey, I should only have milestones for what the customer wants us to track. So if you aren't clear on what your standard is and don't tell people, your schedules are going to be quite a bit inconsistent, and you might not be successful at scheduling because people frequently work with different project managers on different teams. Let's go to this one. And what I have found out is people say on tip 7 here, we have a critical path and that's all we care about. Well, are you sure about that? So let me pull back in Microsoft Project. And if you look at the critical path, and by the way, you can use some of the new shortcuts, just check the checkbox for critical. You can see things that are driving the end date. But just because it's not on the critical path doesn't mean you can't do it, or you might not want to do it. I say there's such a thing as business critical. So I frequently add a custom field, and I did this earlier already, where you can label what's business critical. I don't care if we do everything on the critical path. If we don't complete these business items, we fail in our project. So that's something, another takeaway you can do. And I already showed you that quick tip to quick add new columns. By the way, some other things people do, and you probably heard this in another session, and you can go back, I think it was Thomas Boyle that was talking about this. You can use missed deadlines and your deadline indicators to see if you're kind of heading on track or not. Now, besides what I've just shown here, let's talk about something else. Scheduling is a roadmap and things come up. Here's what I tell my team. This is a roadmap for success, but we need to work together, and I need your help in determining what is business critical so we don't miss it. And I even sometimes add another column that said what is customer critical. Maybe for our organization to get paid, we have to do these 4 things, but for the customer to be happy, there's 4 other things that we should monitor. Don't you see the value in knowing that before you reach the end of the project and have a failure? And certainly communicate with your team that things will come up and we should work together on those. Tip 8, define your resource capacity. And there were quite a few sessions already that talked about, for example, in Project Online, that you have capacity here. But if you don't have a way to be consistent on this, this adds no value. For example, have you decided that all project work is being maintained in Project Online? If not, have you decided that 50% of the work is here? So I had an automotive manufacturer recently, and they were telling me that people were always overworked, they were not getting things done, but their boss wouldn't hire anyone. And their boss was looking at the screen saying, you know, when I look through, we're not even using all of our resources. Well, it turns out they had maybe 20% of their projects in the system, so this was not a good measure. So that's one issue. Other issues that I've had is companies try to adjust resource capacities in other ways, and people are not aware. So as an example, I worked with a laboratory company, and they said, we think people overestimate. So how about we just cut every task down to 50% of what they provide, and from there we will just see how it goes. Well, the laboratory company said with the first couple of projects, they were pretty close to meeting their deadlines. But resources started figuring this out, that their estimate would be cut, and they started adding time for their estimate. The other thing that you should consider is resource capacity looks or indicators could not add necessarily the value you expect. So for example, I'm sure some of you have seen these overallocation indicators before. Did you know that you can set the level of threshold on when they appear? And this is a resource feature. Under options, even if you do not use leveling, this controls the level of detail of how project looks. For example, if they go over 8 hours a day, is that a problem? If they go over 40 hours a week, is that a problem? And as you change this, the indicators, some may disappear actually. And you might find that in your own schedule. So maybe we're not as overallocated as we think we are. Our resources are skilled at dividing their work across the month. We don't have to spend time drilling into that much detail. And what a lot of people say is, well, sometimes our resources are overworked, but is it really the reality? And I hope none of you ever have this situation. Now, tip 9 is kind of one of my favorites. Gather the right status details. Are you actually paying attention to what matters? And I worked with a company just a few weeks ago, and they happen to be in construction. The general contractor was in the room asking all the subs, what's your percent complete? Every subcontractor in the room said it's 75% or higher. And once the general contractor left the room, I asked that same question again, and I got numbers like 30% or 40%. And of course, I had to ask, why was that the case? These subcontractors were not getting paid until they reported 75% or higher. So I told the general contractor, maybe you're asking the wrong question. So I said, here are some different questions. Ask if they have started, and as terms of duration, how many days have they accomplished? They might say 10 as an example. And what's their recommended remaining duration as of what they know right now? And you will get much better answers. Let the tool figure out percent complete. And it's surprising how many people get hung up on percent complete. So I have another story. I had a company that flew me out and they said, percent complete is broken. Here's what they wanted to do. They wanted to enter, let's assume a 10 duration task, 10 days, enter 5 days, calculates 5%, or excuse me, 50%, but then they wanted to change remaining duration to 7 days. And they said, but project keeps changing percent complete. So it was surprising how much time I spent showing them some basic algebra, but what they actually ended up wanting was not percent complete calculated. They wanted their own custom field that they could put in their own percent that had a different meaning for them. We ended up using the physical percent complete field. Also, what they ended up doing is they said, we have this really complicated formula we want you to help us with. And they had it all written on the board and they had computers everywhere. And I said, oh, do you mean this feature that's built right into Microsoft Project? And it was called status. And so they said, huh, maybe we didn't need to fly you out here for that simple question. But at least this is a great way to focus in on what you need. And if you're currently running a project right now, did you know that some of the fields in project have bonus filters to help you better manage project? And here's an example right here. You can use these to focus in on what you need. Number 10, auditing. And this is the story I talked about in kind of the intro video. So there was a person in the healthcare field, and he was finding a way to get bonuses. They would issue quarterly bonuses if your schedule was projected to be within 20% of budget. And budget was time and cost for this organization. And this one particular project manager was getting a bonus every quarter. But everyone else they looked at was not getting a bonus every quarter. They were getting it maybe every third quarter or every fourth quarter. So they said, Cindy, why don't you look at his schedule and see if you can determine anything? Which is exactly what I did. Let me show you what this person was doing. They had gone into their calendar, and not the typical holidays, they had additional non-working days. As an example, they had a friendship day and fun Friday day and treat your boss to coffee day. He had all kinds of extra exception days. And what I learned is this person would remove those if the schedule would get far behind and suddenly he would be back on track. And I said, you know, you never gave this person any guidance on what a good schedule is, so they think that's okay. The other thing the person was doing, and you probably have used baselines before to track variance, is he was overwriting baselines when there was too much variance. Well, that's not a good idea either. And if you have Project Online now, you can protect some of those baselines. By the way, here is a tip that kind of saved my job. I was given a schedule to take over from a project manager that left the organization, and I immediately took another baseline. And there's, of course, several you can pick from. How that saved me is my boss said, Cindy, you're very, very far behind. I don't know if we can keep you on this project. And I said, wait a minute. Would you like to see the variance? When I took over, I captured another baseline. And once they saw the variance was a little bit smaller, I was able to continue running the projects. So auditing can look for maybe standards that aren't being followed. It can actually validate your training to see if what you're training is what's being implemented. And I'll read off a quote from Wemher von Braun, who says, one test is worth 1,000 expert opinions. How you can implement this right away is you can actually create company filters that put your standards in. Maybe, for example, you have a minimum of 5 milestones. You could have a filter. In fact, there is one already built in that looks for milestones. Or you could set up something on those custom fields like business critical. So before I get into all of the summary items, let me pause for a question, and I have additional takeaways to share as well. Are there any questions that have come in?
Hello, Cindy. This is Shri. I do not see any questions in the chat that have come through.
Okay, thank you. But we do have a tip. Thank you. And it says, notes only allow for more than 255 characters in project. So thank you, Troy. That is a very good tip. So let's review kind of our 10 tips for success. I hope you have seen how your organization can tailor these tips to become a guideline for success for your business and map to your value discipline, which is going to take you the next step further. I have some additional takeaways, and at the end here, I'll show you a slide so you can email me if you want some of these things. You may know my colleague Eric, who's also presenting at this conference. If you have not been up to date on Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella's book, you can read our book review. If you like some quick tips, as a project manager, I put some of those together. And if you're new to Project Online, I was interviewed for a podcast, and I'm more than happy to share these with you afterwards. Also, a lot of people typically ask me where some of these slides come from and some of these pictures. They're Pixabay photos, and you can choose to use the free ones, or you can donate money to the people that put those in there. So here's some additional things that I want you to kind of keep in mind. Well, remember from our keynote, Corey Sauls was talking about failure is an opportunity to grow. We should have a growth mindset so we can gain value. And just because you do something every day doesn't mean you can't improve. Take, for example, monkeys. Even though every single day they swing from tree to tree, that doesn't mean they don't fall occasionally and they can try to improve again. So I hope I've given you some excellent tips to take with you. I will stick around for some additional questions. And here is my contact info so you can reach me again later. And Sheree, back over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. That is a very lovely presentation and a good source of information. I see some folks saying it's an excellent presentation, and thank you for your valuable information. Okay, thank you folks for who attended this presentation. And the next one starts at 8 o'clock, and it is about Project Server on Premises Does Agile. Please stick around to listen to that. Thank you. I'm going to end the meeting, Cindy, or do you want me to keep it for a little bit?
You can end that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, guys.